All right, let's finish up by talking about some of the sub-regions. Um, not completely, but I do want to highlight especially Korea. We've talked about Japan already. We'll talk about Korea, a little bit on Mongolia. So Mongolia is another one of these sparsely populated buffer states. Only a few million people live in Mongolia. It's right up next to Siberia and sort of in between China and the Siberian part of Russia. So it kind of is a buffer area between China and Russia. One thing about its economy is that China has become increasingly invested in Mongolia because Mongolia has a lot of natural resources, especially things like metals that would be used in things like cell phones and that sort of thing. So it even has a nickname Minegolia because of all the mining that's taking place, supported by Chinese companies. And the Koreas. The Koreas have had a long history of colonization and occupation. Japan occupied Korea in 1910, so as Japan started to expand its empire, it took over Korea for a long time. And so it did belong to Japan, but Japan, when losing in World War II, gave it up. But like you have a situation that's very similar to East and West Europe, but in Korea it's between the North and the South. You have the North that's controlled by the Soviet Union. Soviet Union kind of controls that northern part of it. And the South is controlled by the United Nations and particularly the United States. So the US is really in charge in the South and USSR or Soviet Union in the North. And both were very poor after the war, controlled by dictators, one propped up by the Soviet Union, one propped up by the United States. There was a war that took place where the North, the two would fight each other. So at first, the boundary was right along this 38th parallel here of latitude. And during the war, the front of the war would move north and it would move south. But eventually, they came to a ceasefire pretty close to where they had started. Now, here's the point, though. The boundary between North Korea and South Korea is not the war never ended. This is just where the fighting stopped. This is the ceasefire line. So this is a highly militarized zone where no one has ever signed a treaty or anything ending the war. With President Trump, and when he was first elected, there was some talk of that. If you remember seeing pictures of him going to talk to the leader of North Korea, that was one of the things that people talked about. Maybe we could end the Korean War because it never ended from the 1950s. It just came to a stalemate, and no one's just shooting at each other anymore most of the time. But it is a precarious situation between the North and the South. And since that stalemate, the two have evolved very differently. Both started out with, poor and with dictatorships. So in North Korea, you had a communist Soviet Union-backed dictatorship that had harsh and complete control of the country. However, because they're so insulated and their economy was only, propped up by the Soviet Union, very insulated, they didn't have connections with the outside world, and they remained very poor and very food insecure. That there's been periods where there's been massive starvation in this part of Korea in the north. However, since they're still in a war footing, they've maintained a very large army and a lot of nuclear weapons. They're a very dangerous country in terms of their military. Now in the south here, though, it started under similar circumstances to the north. They were very poor under a dictatorship. But one thing that their dictatorship did was try to boost their economy by what's called state capitalism. So remember, this is one of the Asian tigers, South Korea. And their economy evolved with state capitalism, where the government would kind of front money and try to prop up some big companies to grow and become bigger companies. And now that's really grown into a very highly industrialized economy. Some of the countries that were propped up include, Samsung, Hyundai, LG, names you would probably be very familiar with. These were promoted by the government, and eventually that economic growth, when people started to have a lot of money, that helped to kind of bring along reforms and make the country more democratic as well. So people enjoy more freedom now after that economic growth. So just some comparisons. This is Seoul. By the way, Seoul, pretty close to the North Korean border. So that's kind of scary because they're still on a war footing. That if there was fighting were to resume, this is if we kind of go back to the, I'll just tell you, it's one of the biggest cities in the world. It's right along the North Korean border, and this is what it looks like. Very vibrant, very a big, this is a big economic powerhouse in Korea, especially in the Seoul area. This is Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea. Totally different vibe. Looks very kind of Soviet Union era communist construction. Not a lot of, not very well lit. In fact, this is kind of odd. This is a picture taken from space, showing this is South Korea with its capital Seoul here, and this big almost empty spot here between South Korea and China. This is North Korea, and what's odd is that you can almost not see it at night because it's not very well lit. So it's not very well lit, very poor, a lot of, and that disparity between the two creates a lot of tension as well. And we've talked about Hong Kong already. I just want to, this is Taiwan. This is where, if you remember the communists kicked, after World War II, the communists kicked out the nationalists. So there's a different government in Taiwan than there is in China. But it's really questionable, but China does not recognize it as being independent from China. China sees it as like a wayward province. There's always conflict between, if the US, tries to support Taiwan, it makes China mad. It's a difficult situation. And lastly, I actually put this in, it's kind of timely during the 2016, this figure showing, because at that time there was a lot of talk about who supports the TPP. Everybody was kind of beating up on it. It's called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was a program that before 2016 was going to be a new free trade agreement, kind of like NAFTA, but like a bigger NAFTA that included the NAFTA countries, Japan, Vietnam, Australia. It was going to be like a bigger NAFTA. Now, one country it did not include, which is kind of a misunderstood thing, is China. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership was to kind of like an expansion of NAFTA to counteract China's economic growth, because China's doing trade relationships where it's trying to expand its influence in the Pacific, and the United States and other countries wanted to kind of counter that with this new Trans-Pacific Partnership. Because of a lot of these agreements are associated with offshoring of work, they become unpopular. But one thing to note, the new USMCA, the new trade agreement that replaced NAFTA, is kind of built on many of the elements of this Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was so beat up, which everybody kind of beat up on in the past. So that won't be on the test. It's just interesting.